You're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Thanks so much for joining me here on the Tomorrow Society podcast. This is your host, Dan Heaton. Today's episode is going to be a bit of a different format. I'm here by myself just to tell you about my recent trip to Walt Disney World. Our family went for 4 nights over Martin Luther King weekend, and rather than doing a straightforward trip report, I thought I would describe it in terms of the 7 lessons that I learned on my Disney World trip. It was a really great trip and very different than how we typically have done our recent trips in the past. So I was able to experience some things in Disney services that I hadn't experienced before. So I hope you enjoy what I have to say, and I'll be back in just a moment. Okay, well, it is time to tell you the 7 lessons that I learned on my recent Disney World trip. And I will say up front that this will not probably be lessons that are mind-blowing for you. I'm not talking about some really inventive touring strategy that no one has ever thought of before. This is more personally for me, things that probably are very common for Disney World veterans, but just based on the types of trips that I've done, I haven't really experienced in the past. So let's get these rolling. Here we go with number 1. Disney's Animal Kingdom Lodge is an incredible resort, even if you have a standard room. So to give a little background in terms of my family, we typically have stayed at off-site condos. This is due to a timeshare that we've had access to. So that's allowed us to save a lot of money and have a lot of space. Way back in the past, my wife and I did stay at Pop Century, and I grew up staying at a lot of on-site resorts at Disney World when the prices were a little different. But because this trip was a lot shorter, it made sense for me to stay on site. And I also was really interested to try it because it's been a while since I had actually stayed on site. And so we kind of started looking at moderates, but we really decided with a good room-only discount that we could do the Animal Kingdom Lodge. And I'd heard so many good things about the resort that I really wanted to check it out. Now, my expectations were high, but I did not expect to enjoy it even as much as I did. I love this resort. I would go back in a heartbeat. It would be tough. Barring one of the monorail resorts, I could not see myself going back and staying at a different deluxe if I had the option rather than the Animal Kingdom Lodge. We ended up in a standard room, but thanks to touring plans, Room Finder, and some nice advice on the Diz boards, I did submit a room request that allowed us to have a standard room that we did have a view of the savannas. We were not looking at a parking lot. We were not looking at a dumpster. And this was room 4318. And I would highly recommend this room. Your view is a little further away from the savannah. We were on the Kudu Trail, but I would say this is a great room to have, especially if you aren't willing to spend the money for the Savannah room. And honestly, it was over $100 a night more for the Savannah room, and I just don't think it was worth it, especially for a short trip if you plan to spend most of your time in the parks. I mean, we saw zebras. One night we came back from the hotel, and there was a giraffe outside our window. The one morning, there were 6 zebras that walked by. We saw most of the animals that you have a possibility of seeing from our window. And given all the other public viewing areas that you have just walking down the halls or near the lobby of Jambo House, I cannot imagine that you could have this room and be disappointed. The only thing I can say about the standard rooms there is I wish they were just a little bit configured slightly differently. It's not even that much about the size. I mean, you go to Disney World knowing, even with a deluxe resort, the rooms are not going to be big. This is 344 square feet. I will say the bathroom itself seems a little too small even for that, especially the toilet and shower. I mean, it was almost impossible to close the door. But we still had an amazing time at the Animal Kingdom. We used the Mara. If you have younger kids and especially don't want to sit down and have meals over and over, the Mara is a great place to grab food. I started grabbing food one night for dinner and in the morning and picking things up. And it was a bit of a walk, especially if you have kids, but it's so convenient. And the food was much better than I would expect from a typical kind of food court, or this is more of a counter service than a food court. We also ate breakfast at Boma, which was awesome and not really that pricey. And I know the dinner gets up there, but Boma, I've heard its reputation being one of the top buffets at Disney World, and I cannot argue with that. And we also had good experiences with the bus service. Yes, the Animal Kingdom Lodge is more remote. It was about a 20-minute bus ride to the Magic Kingdom and about 15 to Epcot, which are the two parks we went to on this trip. So if you are looking to maximize your time, especially when you're not talking the Magic Kingdom, I can see wanting to stay closer. However, if you're going to stay on the monorails, it's generally going to cost more. And if you rent a car for the Magic Kingdom, you really don't save any time because you have to deal with the monorail or ferry parking situation. And with one exception, which was after the fireworks on our final day, we were able to sit on the buses. Coming home back to the resort, you have to stop at Kidani Village, but that was really a minor inconvenience of a few minutes. I found the bus system to work very well from the Animal Kingdom Lodge. It's a gorgeous resort. If there's anything where the Disney details, as they're called, would stand out in a resort, I can't imagine too many would be beyond this. There are so many nooks and crannies where you can just find interesting art, interesting artifacts, great viewings for animals, and there's so much to do at this resort. We barely took advantage of any of it, and so I can give a big thumbs up to the Animal Kingdom Lodge. Beyond the location, which I can see being an issue for some, there are very few negative things I can say. The food is great. And it's just a really cool resort to stay in. It doesn't feel like you're in the chaos of Disney World, which is what you want if you're going to spend on a deluxe resort. Number 2, Disney's Magical Express can work out perfectly if you have the right luck. Well, this was the first time that I'd used Disney's Magical Express. We typically drive down. We flew before we had kids, but would rent a car, and we since then have driven. So because this was a short trip over a holiday weekend, we obviously didn't want to drive all the way from Missouri. So we decided to fly. And then I figured that why not, if we're going to stay on site, let's do the full experience without renting a car. Let's take Magical Express. Let's take the buses. Let's see how it works. And for the most part, it worked out great. And again, when you're traveling, my kids are just shy of 7 and just shy of 3. And they're both girls. And you have a lot of luggage, even for a short trip. We had a stroller. So being able to not have to pick up that checked luggage was really nice. And I don't want to sound too much like an advertisement for Disney, because there are trade-offs with Magical Express. We totally lucked out. We basically walked up to the counter, and this was on a Thursday evening. Our flight landed at 7:10 Eastern Time. It took us a little while to walk over there, but by the time we actually got there and got on the bus, it was less than 10 minutes before we left. We were one of the last people to make it on the bus, and we're lucky to get seats. So in that case, by getting on the bus so near when they were departing, we basically saved a ton of time. And we ended up, it took us about, I think, from when we stepped onto the bus to when we arrived at the resort was about 50 minutes, and most of that was travel time. So I'm not sure we could have done much better. On the ride back, the only stop the bus made when we got on was at Coronado Springs, very short stop, and then basically went to the airport. So I've heard plenty of stories of people who stopped at 3 or 4 resorts, barely made their flight, had to rush. That was not the case here. We had luck on both ends. The only thing I could say is it did take a while for our bags to get there, and Disney has said that it would take 3 hours. It was about 3.5 hours from when we landed, which would not have been a big deal if we were going to the parks, but it was pretty late at night. And we did obviously know not to pack essential things in our checked luggage. But I can't really blame Magical Express for that. Obviously, if we had driven, we would not have gotten to the resort that much earlier. But obviously, we would have had our bags from the start, but we would have had to pick up our bags. So it's a trade-off. If you're looking to maximize every minute at Disney World and aren't as concerned with having to get the luggage or anything like that, I wouldn't recommend it. But at least in our case, I did feel like it took some of the stress out of the resort. And doing the check-in to the airline check-in at our resort was also great because we had some extra time on our departure day, got rid of our big bags, explored the resort, and we had no issues with getting them in St. Louis. So in general, I'd give a thumbs up for Magical Express. Number 3. When it rains at Disney World, attack the parks. Now, coming into our week, I was getting very nervous because on the week of our trip, I had read the weather reports that not only would it be raining on our first day at the Magic Kingdom, which was the Friday, it would be a downpour with potential for small hail. Now, going with kids, especially with the stroller, the last thing you really want to deal with is a huge downpour because you park the stroller, it gets soaked, you're done. So basically, I did have some concerns there. And also coming in on a holiday weekend, it was one of those things where I expected large crowds. So I was thinking, we don't need to add rain to this equation. But the good thing about this is we went to the Magic Kingdom on a day that Touring Plans had listed as a 10 out of 10 on the crowd calendar, which was Friday, January 15th. And we got there in the midst of a very strong rain, and there was hardly anyone at the parks. And so basically what we were able to do, and if we had just been 2 adults, it could have been much more. But we basically went up and did Mickey Mouse right away at Town Square. We used our FastPass for Seven Dwarfs Mine Train, which was running, and that is a concern with rain, is that a ride like that might not be running. And we were able to see a ton of things with very little wait around the Fantasyland area and then near the Haunted Mansion. And we also were able to grab daily Fast Passes very quickly. I did even notice, I did not grab one, there were actually Seven Dwarfs Mine Train daily Fast Passes available around about 12 on noon that day. You could have grabbed one. It probably would have been later in the day, but you see what the rain could do. And now the rain did subside, thankfully, and the sun came out, which brought in much larger crowds. But in terms of a busy day at the Magic Kingdom, and the Magic Kingdom is not always the best place to do in terms of rain. Places like Hollywood Studios and Epcot seem to be slightly better because they have more, you have indoor attractions, and you have Epcot especially, you have some of the longer shows and movies that you can kind of do. But it worked out great for us in terms of dealing with the weather. And we were poured on a few times. I would not want to have that the whole day, especially when it's not particularly warm. But if you have a rainy day and you're willing to get a little wet, you can really do great things, especially at the Magic Kingdom on a busy day, because we didn't even get there that early. We got there maybe 9:35, and if we had really just gone for the headliners, we could have probably hit a ton of things in a short period of time. Number 4, there are ways to maximize FastPass Plus even under the new restrictive system. Now, what I mean by that is I am not a big fan of FastPass Plus. I grew up with just standby lines, and I don't mean to be an old fuddy-duddy here because I use paper FastPass very effectively on some of our trips where we rode headliners repeatedly. I found at Disneyland I was able to even use more due to the short walking distance. So I was a big proponent of paper FastPass, though I didn't really like the idea, like with Toy Story Mania, of having to rush to get them. However, I felt like you could really take advantage, and they did not have a strong impact on the lines for second-tier attractions like Pirates and Haunted Mansion and Spaceship Earth, which did not really have much use for the FastPass or even have FastPasses like Pirates. So my first trip with FastPass Plus about a year ago, it was okay, but I found it kind of irritating because we got stuck in some standby lines that took a really long time. This time we had the 60-day window because we stayed on site. So I booked all of my FastPasses each day early in the day. So basically I gave us a little cushion, but it was kind of the 9, 10, 11 way to go, though mine was more like 9:30, 11, 12:30. But the idea was to get them out early and then try to use day FastPasses with the kiosk. Now, the problem there, of course, is you have to wait in lines for them. But we found that the kiosk in Fantasyland near PhilharMagic never had a wait. There's a lot of them, and they seem to just not draw the same crowds as the kiosks in the Frontierland around kind of near the Country Bears area there. That one still had long lines. We had no problem picking up extra ones, and we did not even work that hard to maximize them. I figured that if you really had either older kids or were just adults, you could really make do very well. Now, there are still downsides. I did notice one time at Mission Space where our standby line was not moving at all, and we eventually just got out of the line. It was so bad. But in general, I felt like we had good luck with FastPass lines moving better this time. The standby lines, especially at something like Pirates, were not the same issue they were the last time. So I think Disney has gotten better at using FastPass Plus, and that's really important because if you're going to institute a system like this, it better work well because there are still downsides with the tiering, especially not at the Magic Kingdom. Only being able to pick 3 and not being able to add more on the app. It's not a foolproof, amazing system. However, I found on this trip that I could see how it could work. I don't love it. I still don't like how it makes it really hard to re-ride many things. But we did do a little more rewriting this time, and I think you could, if you really studied it out, you could take even better advantage than we did on our few days on the trip. And I'll be interested to see with some of the parks that are adding very popular probably attractions like Epcot with Frozen, Pandora, and then down the road with Toy Story and Star Wars lands, how that will impact FastPass Plus at those parks. Will they become closer to the Magic Kingdom? Not there yet, but eventually where you can also make better use of Fast Passes. Number 5, do not fear the holiday weekend. I was very nervous about going on a weekend that had such high expectations for crowds. In the past, Martin Luther King weekend, historically, I know was popular, but had been, popular in terms of January, but not super popular. But when I saw the crowd calendar coming up with 10s and 9s, I haven't really visited as an adult on those kinds of days. We've gotten used to going in January and February, and with one of our daughters still being very young, I was nervous to face big crowds. But honestly, it wasn't that bad. And I know the results, like I mentioned, the first day we had some rain, but the second day at Epcot and then our third day, which was at the Magic Kingdom, the results ended up being not as crowded, but it was pretty crowded. But it wasn't that hard to do that much. In a sense, it almost, having the crowds, extends the hours. So you have a case where you don't have a park like the Magic Kingdom closing at 7. It closed at midnight. Now, we didn't stay that late, but one night we did stay till after 10 for the fireworks. And what happened is we were able to see quite a lot in the 7, 8 o'clock range, which a lot of times in the off season, it's not even open that long. Another factor is you saw them running more trains and putting things more at the peak level. So I saw even on Big Thunder Mountain where you could tell there were multiple trains running, much more than I've seen in the past. So by running at that higher level, you might even have more people in the parks, but you don't really have that much longer lines. Yes, there were slight things. I still cannot believe that I waited 15 minutes in line for Journey to Imagination with Figment. And I even waited about 10 or 15 minutes for the Three Caballeros. And those are things that I never thought I would wait for in my life. And I can't really blame FastPass for that. I can blame it just for there being, more people in the parks. And there were times when I did notice kind of outlandish lines, like Small World having 60 minutes, or even Spaceship Earth being 45, but we just avoided those lines. For the most part, it did not seem much more crowded than the weekends, any other weekend in January and February where I've been there. And that's what I wondered too, because after how high the fall crowds were, it was interesting to see that the crowds really did not seem to be that different than other January times. And we had good weather overall. The day at Epcot was in the high 70s and sunny all day. That Sunday, the 17th, was in the 60s, but it did not rain. It was very pleasant, actually. It was optimal for an off-season theme park day, even with being a little chilly to get a little wet on Splash Mountain. But I did it anyway. It's my one of my favorite rides. But I did find the weather was good enough, so after that first day with the rain, you would have expected crowds to go up. And it turned out the actual results for those days was about a 7 for that Sunday. But it really didn't feel that crowded. And it makes me wonder, too, for down the road with our kids, because my oldest daughter we're not going to take out of school for a significant time. Things like spring break. And I know spring break is more crowded. But I can imagine that if we can handle this with younger kids, when our kids get older, I think we'll be able to handle things like if we decide to go on spring break or President's Day or Columbus Day or whatnot, that yes, it's going to be more crowded, but if you go in with the right expectations, we'll be fine. Number 6, Magic Bands are actually convenient. This is one that really surprised me because when I don't wear watches, I don't particularly like to wear anything on my wrist. And I'd also heard a lot of issues about Magic Bands not working very well in terms of your fast passes, your entry, things like that. And I found that the Magic Bands work very well. I mean, I say this having the fact that our Magic Bands never really worked at our room, but it was one of those things where it was messed up when we got there, and the person at the desk told me I easily probably could have fixed that situation, but I didn't find it that hard to use the room keys. So I'm saying this kind of with the caveat of, no, it wasn't totally perfect. Our Magic Bands didn't work very well in the room. However, they did work out okay in terms of the parks. We never had an issue with the fast passes. Everything worked with our entry. I did not use it to buy food, which I know is what Disney wants, is me to hook up my credit card to it. The only time I did was at Be Our Guest because they had something where you didn't have to have your PIN code because I couldn't remember my PIN code. And I felt like in that case, it's not that hard. I kind of like the idea of still paying with a credit card and still kind of having it in my head that feels like real money. It's a little different, though. With everything else, I felt like it was really nice to not have to get up to the FastPass line and look for our tickets and say, whose pass is this? Is this yours? And my girls also loved it. They're still playing with them at home right now, especially for my daughter, my older daughter, being able to go up and scan the band herself. I mean, things like that are things that I really don't think about that much when I go to the parks in advance thinking about it, but it was fun. It was fun to have them in advance and get the box, and it's all kind of theater from Disney in order to sell the magic, and I know it's a little silly, but in general, it worked out fine. It was nice, and we did not get the photo pass, but it was still cool. You could scan it, and at least I can go on and look at them, though I doubt I will purchase them because we did take so many pictures on our own. But it's still, if you were going to use that, that's also a really nice benefit there. So I wouldn't say the Magic Bands are perfect. I still think that, it's kind of like everything with My Magic Plus and Fast Passes and everything, and FastPass Plus. I'm not entirely sold. I'd much rather they have focused on attractions and not so much on these extra things. But given the landscape we currently have, I found that the doom and gloom, the sky is falling, is not really the case here. And number 7, Be Our Guest is still a theme park restaurant. However, it's also a very cool destination. And what I mean by that is this, because, we're going in not a super busy time, we were able to book lunch at Be Our Guest. And I did not book this 180 days out. I booked this we didn't even decide to do our trip until October. So it was possibly 90 days out maybe when I booked our lunch. I did put it at 1:55 in the afternoon on the Friday. So, you do have to make some sacrifices. There was obviously no dinner available, which would probably go much further back to the 180-day window or further. But for lunch, I had no problems booking it. Everything went smoothly. The decor is gorgeous. I had not gone there before. The food was good. The food is solid. I would not say it's amazing. By the standards of the Magic Kingdom, it's definitely better than some of the other offerings like Pinocchio Village House or even Columbia Harbor House, which we did not have a very good experience at this time, unfortunately. But it's a little frenetic. You still we did the pre-ordering. You come in with your receipt, grabbing a table. It still is crowded, so it is a theme park restaurant. your trip will not be ruined if you don't make it to be our guest. It's a nice restaurant. It's a cool place. I really like we stayed in the West Wing room with, the lightning strikes and the rose, and those are really cool things. But it's good. I would do it again if I could, but I don't think it's a necessity. It does not rank as one of my favorite meals on the trip. I had a better meal our first night when we arrived at the Mara, so that gives you kind of an idea of where it was. It nowhere near ranks to how I thought Boma was, even at breakfast. However, it was a very solid meal. It's a really cool destination, and it's too bad that it's so popular where people who want to experience it aren't able to experience it. So those are my 7 lessons from my recent Disney World trip. There's a lot more that I experienced during this trip, and I've been writing about a lot of these in individual posts for the blog. This is where, if you want to read over 2,000 words about what I think about FastPass Plus, including what we booked in advance and what our day of FastPasses were, that's all there on tomorrowsociety.com. I'm going to have individual reviews of our Boma breakfast and of Be Our Guest, and I also wrote about Magical Express, and I'm going to write about some of our other experiences there. So I would definitely suggest checking that out if you found this podcast interesting. Also, if you like this podcast, please go ahead and give us a rating on iTunes. I would love to get more ratings and reviews because that allows more people to find this podcast. And I really enjoyed the feedback, and I know that more of you are finding this podcast. And I just want to keep growing it so that more of you can hear it and give your feedback on what you like. Because in the future, I am definitely planning on having a lot more great interviews lined up for you. So this is kind of more of an aberration in terms of how the episodes will go. If this is your first episode, I definitely recommend going back and listening to some of my other interviews with Sam Genoway and Len Testa and Chad Emerson and others. I think that is the general format of this podcast, but this was so much fun I wanted to give you just a piece of what we had on a really great Disney World trip. This is one of my favorite trips I've ever taken, and we only went to the park for 3 days. It's interesting because I didn't put it as a lesson, but another lesson that I would say as an offshoot is that a really short Disney trip can be great. You don't have to see everything on every trip. If you're going once, twice, 3 times a year, it's okay to do 2 days, 3 days. You don't need to maximize everything. We were able to see so much over 3 days, and we were exhausted by the end. So this was probably about the right speed. So I hope that you enjoyed this show. If you have any suggestions about future shows or other thoughts, please email me, dan@tomorrowsociety.com, and I'll be back talking to you guys again really soon.